All right, just give it a second for the live stream to commence, and then we will get down to our review. All right, that seems to be stable over there on the live stream. So why don't we go ahead and begin? Good afternoon, evening to everyone. It is great to see you, or at the very least, to be seen by you if you're coming through the YouTube stream. This is our 14th class in our discussion of Judaism for the year 5782. And you may be thinking to yourself as we've been going through these, it keeps saying the year 5782. 57, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Let's just leave the other microphones muted for the time being. What is that 5,782 number? Well, if you have been checking your Jewish calendar, you may know that that is the year in the Jewish reckoning. But 5,782, well, what happened during all that time? Well, Jewish history has a very particular view. History in general, especially in the ancient world, but really up into the modern as well, is meant to teach us something more than a mere outlining of a sequence of events. If you wish to read just an outline of a sequence of events, then you can read a timeline, although I will caution you that even in a timeline, how things are phrased, what things are included and what are left off, will still slant your understanding of that time period. There really is no way to do history without making a statement about its content. Well, that means when we look at Jewish history and we look at it through the lens of Judaism, as opposed to just being an academic subject, we should be looking for what is the message, what is the purpose of the retelling of this history. And Judaism in particular considers itself to be a very historical faith, a very historical culture. That doesn't just mean that we have a lot of history. We do, we're old, we've been around for a long time, and we've seen an awful lot of what this world has. But it means that Judaism believes that history is directional, not cyclical. Yes, each month, each year, the cycle of a person's life, there are beginning, middles, and ends, and returns to the beginning again and again. But overall, we see history moving in a direction. We see history being guided towards a certain direction, and we feel a call of the commandments to behave in a way in order that history will move in a certain direction. And for those of you who are hearing this and thinking this all sounds very obvious, please understand that this is not universal. In the ancient world, as well as even in the modern world, there are many cultures and faiths that do not see anything as being progress, anything as being directional, anything as having time's arrow pointed in a particular way. You live, you are born, you live, you die, and it'll be the same for your children as it was for your parents. And that is all you should expect, and all that one should imagine. The idea that God, or even in the pagan ideas, the gods, were moving humanity through the passage of history towards some ultimate culmination. Well, they may have had some concept of a Ragnarok or apocalypse or end of times, but they didn't really have an understanding that there was a pattern, a plot, if you will, through the narrative of time. Judaism is an astoundingly good storytelling religion. And as such, when we look through history, we need to understand the overarching story. So enough of the introduction, enough of the sales pitch that history is important. We will come back to this idea over and over, and hopefully I will give you a few more reasons why history is important as we go on. But let's begin 5,782 years ago with the Jewish concept of creation, of Maaseh Bereshit, the act of bringing the entire universe into being. As we see from these passages taken from the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is a statement of beginning. Just as we have a belief that the universe is headed somewhere, we also believe that it came from somewhere. This was in stark contrast to many other faiths up until the 20th century, when many people, including scientists prior to the 20th century, believed that the entire universe had always existed and would always exist. It wasn't until the invention of the Big Bang Theory, which was invented, or the phrasing of which was invented as an insult to the idea, that science began to come around to the notion that there was a beginning. But Judaism has had this since our beginning, and it gives that time's arrow an anchor and a directional vector. What do we know about this creation? Not only that things were made, but in particular, God created the human, Adam, in his image. In God's image, he created him, male and female, he created them. And yes, the pronouns are confusing, mostly because, as we've talked about in other classes, Hebrew is a very gendered language, which doesn't always refer to gender despite the genderification of the language. Obviously, God, as we've talked about in our other belief series, does not have any form, but we have to use the pronoun he simply out of convention and common translation. Really, you should be comfortable putting any pronoun there, and it shouldn't make a difference, as God is beyond any of the nouns that we know. But more confusingly is the phrase that male and female, he created them, after having just used a singular. Now, what this is trying to tell us is that both male and female are a representation of God's image, but this image is not about the shape of the body, but is about the shape of the soul, about the purpose of the human creation. And that purpose is attainable and indeed incumbent upon all of us, male, female, or any other description you care to name. That means we have to be attentive that this creation of the world was for a purpose, that this purpose culminates in the creation of humanity, which shares a similarity to God that is unlike the similarity in any other part of God's creation. And now we have the seed set for the great task of being human. Now, but that task is not just about being created in God's image, because we know that we are made from the dust of the ground. As it says in chapter 2, God blew into the nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living creature. The Torah is laying out for us from the very beginning this concept that we are made with God's image, we are made with a spiritual connection that is akin to God in a way that no other creation is, but we are also blended into this world, made of the very earth itself, made from the atoms, the molecules, the physical dimension of this world. And that dual nature of humanity is blended together. It's not a dualism in the classical philosophical sense. It is not at odds. It's not a contrast. It's not that one is better than the other. They each are essential in playing their role in guiding us in this world and providing both direction and capacity to live in this world. However, when we eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God responds by saying, see, the man, humanity has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. This is not precisely a criticism, but instead a statement of our condition, that humanity, unique among all of God's creation, is self-aware and morally aware, that we have the capacity to understand right from wrong, not just in a I get rewarded, I get punished mentality that might also work on an animal, but truly an understanding that right is good and wrong is bad. And that is something that, to the best of our understanding of all of God's creation, is unique to the human experience. Thus, the image of us eating from the fruit is testifying to that unique position that we have. But that unique position that we have, therefore, leads us into moral responsibility. Other animals may do things that are good or bad for themselves or others, but they are doing so out of instinct, out of habit, out of pure reaction to the circumstances around them. We, on the other hand, do so and should internally, through the spirit as well as our body, weigh what we are doing as being right or wrong. That means that we, and we alone, can be held accountable for our actions in this world. That gift of free will is baked into the entire purpose of creation. This is the reason why all of this comes at the beginning, setting the stage for the Torah's instructions throughout the rest. And it's why, with the failure of Cain and Abel, we get to the following passage. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? Surely if you do well, there will be lifting up, but if you do not do well, sin crouches at the door. Its longing is for you, yet you can master it. This short little speech that God gives to Cain really sets the stage for everything that is going to come in the human experience throughout the rest of the Torah and throughout the rest of our history. That the history of the world and the history of the Jewish people, as we will focus in on in just a moment, is very much a history of people that are capable of living up to God's design, of living up to God's commands, of living up to the idea of what is good and to avoid what is wrong. And that we have that in our hands to do, to choose what is right or wrong. And if we choose right, then it will be good. If we choose bad, well, then we clearly will be bringing bad upon ourselves and upon others. And this is not about the mechanics of reward and punishment. We'll talk about that in another class when we cover the afterlife. This is about the mechanics of our spiritual path, that if we attract ourselves to the good, we will be better. We will be tasting of the good spiritually. And if we go the opposite direction, then we will be drawing ourselves further and further away from that. Ultimately, this is the plot of the drama of the rest of the history. But of course, the rest of the history has many additional characters and many additional themes that will be emerging over the centuries. One of the first encounters that we have is the limits of this process and introducing an idea and then discounting it. And that is the story of Noah. The Lord saw that the evil of man was great in the earth and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord regretted that he had made man on earth and it grieved him in his heart. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. With you will I establish my covenant. The story of Noah is not a story about a man building a boat. The story of Noah is a story for humanity to understand that if you are expecting God to wipe the slate clean every time we mess up, you are going to be sorely mistaken. That has been tried, it doesn't work, and we come back to the problems of humanity again and again. The only way for us to exit the problems of humanity is for us to actually choose willingly and individually to do what is right, to have that free will epiphany for each and every one of us of doing what is right at each and every moment of our decisions in life. The story of Noah is a cautionary tale, not against humanity, although they certainly needed the caution, but against those of us today that imagine that all we have to do is wait and God will make everything okay. That's not what's going to happen. God sent a rainbow to tell us that he will never wipe out the world again. It is up to us. We cannot shirk that responsibility. Now, the covenant that God made with Noah, was the beginning of this notion that we are meant to be truly in relationship with God. With Noah, it was a limited covenant. It was simply do what is right. But with Abraham, we begin to see a pattern where God is going to establish a covenant with a particular person, with a particular family that will develop into a particular nation with its own unique mission. This narrowing of focus down onto Abraham and then one line of his descendants is not meant to exclude the line of all the other descendants of Abraham or all the other descendants of Noah. Indeed, the Torah goes out of their way to describe and catalog them as well, so that we shouldn't forget that God cares about the rest of the world that he made. But with this description of Noah and then Abraham and then one line of Abraham, we are meant to focus down as Jews on our unique history and our unique role to be played within this tapestry of all of creation. So it is not meant as exclusionary, it is meant merely to give us our particular mission. You alone are the Lord, so says Nehemiah. You made the heavens, the highest heavens and all their host, the earth and everything upon it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrate themselves before you. You are the Lord God. Now, this is all by way of introduction, a quick summary of everything I already mentioned about Bereshit, but then he goes on to bring it to its focus. Who chose Avram, and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham. Very quick summary of Abraham's transformation. Finding his heart true to you, you made a covenant with him to give the land. And this is, of course, describing the land of Israel. Now, this notion that God is going to make a special deal, a special covenant with this special person, is establishing the rest of the pattern. And you may be asking yourself, why? Well, we go all the way back to what I said at the very beginning of creation. The underlying plot is trying to get humanity to choose to do what is right because it is right, and to avoid doing what is wrong because it is bad. How do we do that? Well, on the one hand, God can simply let everyone do what they want. That didn't work out so well. That's why we had the flood of Noah. On the other hand, we can try and establish some ground rules, as we see from the covenant of Noah, and that does a better job, but there are still many problems. And so we see that eventually God is going to want to give a particular task to a particular group that will be able to carry a banner, if you will, that will be able to make an example of a particular way of living that will hopefully inspire, guide, and give hope and encouragement to all others. Not that everyone should be should be identical. As you know, Judaism does not proselytize or seek out people to join us, but to make sure that everyone would recognize that there are ways to live that will make life good and better for you and others, and that you can accomplish this. Again, going back to this theme of free will, we have the option of doing what is right. Look at the Jewish people will be the theme. They have the option of doing what is right. Even under some of the worst circumstances, they continue to hold on to this covenant, and they continue to find a way to come back from even the worst disasters to a position of joy in life and of celebration of being able to live that good life. This is starting now with Abraham, because God is showing that we need to prepare the ground for this group to be able to eventually realize this particular mission. So, having found Abraham the right soil, the right ground to plant the seed, God makes a covenant which will also require a place, a land. There needs to be a place where these people will be nurtured, a nursery, if you will, both of the plant variety or of the baby variety, a place where they can be protected and grown in order to properly take root and properly flourish, so that they will be able to withstand everything that comes after. And that, unfortunately, is extremely difficult to do in a purely nomadic setting. So what happens? Well, God begins to build this Abrahamic family, but also begins to prune, if you will, those who are going to be primarily the focus of this covenant and those who will not be the focus of the covenant. Abraham cannot keep Lot with him and God. Right? This doesn't work. Lot has to be set aside. Lot is too attracted to the fields of Sodom and Gomorrah, to the wealth down there. And so we need to move on to the next generation. The next generation has Isaac and Ishmael. And again, in this generation, only one of them is truly suitable for continuing the covenant. The next generation comes along with Jacob and Esau. And again, only one of them is truly the right match for the continuation of the covenant. So we can see that there is a rough start. God is trying to build up this family, but unfortunately, there are portions of it that continue to leave and be estranged from the original idea that Abraham had of this covenant with God. The third generation looks like it's going to be following the same pattern of brother versus brother, or in this case, brothers versus brother. But there is a twist, there is a reconciliation, the family is brought back together again, and with that, the book of Bereshit, the beginning stage of our people, is brought to a conclusion, that we will remain cohesive, and that will allow us to reinforce each other as we seek to fulfill God's commands through our free will choices. And that first chapter is accomplished with our family, with that final reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, and the beginning of the next generation, which will hold tight to each other, even while in the foreign land of Egypt. Which brings us to Egypt, and we go back to Nehemiah's description of our history. You took note of our father's affliction in Egypt when we were slaves, and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds, where it was splitted. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all the people of his land. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into the raging waters. You led them by day with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light in the way they were to go. Now, why were we being brought out of Egypt? It was not only to allow us to be free, but it was allowing us to be able to go to Mount Sinai, to receive the Torah, to have that set of instruction that will guide us as a nation of individuals choosing to do the right way, because we can actually follow the revealed instructions that were given. No longer is God going to rely on the lucky happenstance that the children of a particular person might be just the right fit to continue and find their way through their own spiritual greatness to that relationship with God. God is giving us a set of instructions that will make it easier for that to happen by being reinforced with the community and having been reinforced through our history and traditions. This gift of Torah, this gift of having this instruction book, is the greatest thing that God ever did for us. Rather than having to climb the mountain each individually, we are given a leg up. And this allows us as a nation to go forward into this next phase of our history. As I mentioned, we see in the summary from first the book of Numbers, I, the Lord your God, am your God. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord your God. Bringing us out of Egypt was so we could be connected to God. And as Nehemiah continues, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. You made known to them your holy Shabbat, and you ordained for them laws, commandments, and teaching through Moses, your servant. You gave them bread from heaven when they were hungry, what we would call manna, and produced water from a rock when they were thirsty. You told them to go and possess the land that you swore to give them. But they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. They stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. If you have read the Tanakh at all, you'll know that the phrase of being a stiff-necked people is a constant refrain, not only in the Torah, but directly and metaphorically throughout the prophets as well. And indeed, this goes back to this initial idea. There is free will, and we continue to choose badly. We have been given instruction, which should make it easier to choose right, but we continue to choose badly. That is not because we are incapable of doing right. It is because we continue to give in to the temptation or the illusions that allow us to think that what is wrong is actually right. And this continues to make us stumble as we go forward, which leads us to the period of Judges after we have settled the land under Joshua. And during this time, it says again in Nehemiah's phrase, the sons came and took possession of the land. You subdued the Canaanite inhabitants of the land before them. You delivered them into the power of their adversaries who oppressed them. In their time of trouble, they cried to you. You in heaven heard them, and in your abundant compassion gave them saviors who saved them from the power of their adversaries. But when they had relief, they again did what was evil in your sight, so you abandoned them to the power of their enemies, who subjugated them. Again they cried to you, and you in heaven heard and rescued them in your compassion, time after time. Now, I mentioned before that Judaism doesn't really like the whole cyclical notion of history, but we did get stuck in a little bit of a Groundhog Day in the book of Judges, where we would do what was right and then stop. And when we stopped, there would be problems. And then we would call out to God. God would give us instructors, saviors that would help lead us. And we would do right and things would get better. And then it would begin to fall apart again in the same pattern. This is establishing that it is possible for us to do what is right. It is possible for us to rise up, but making this a consistent function for all of the nations is extremely hard. Making this as something where we have a cohesion that allows us to reinforce and buttress each other seems to be a difficult hurdle for us to pass, which leads to the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, that God realizes that indeed the period of Judges is inadequate. We need more strength of cohesion. We need to be united more than just as tribal confederation. And so, it says in Samuel 8, all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel, and they said to him, you have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways, which is an understatement. Appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Samuel was displeased that they said, give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied, heed the demand of the people and everything they say to you. For it is not you they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. So what God is trying to tell here to Samuel, who was clearly distressed by their complaint, is that we have the opportunity, but it seems to be that we are not quite living up to it, to merely serve directly under God, to not need a king, to not even need a judge or chieftain. But we seem, especially at that point in our history, to have been unable to reach that critical mass and be able to serve God directly. And so God realizes that, yes, they will need a king, and this is going to allow them to be more cohesive, which is essential at that point in their history, but it will also introduce a number of problems. The first king is Saul, who is followed by David. Now, Saul was a strong man who did much to bring the people together, but he also had difficulty following along with God's commands. And the king, if the king was going to be a Jewish king at all, had to establish as the template, as the archetype, that the king was beneath God. The king was not a God king like Pharaoh. The king was not the one who made all of the rules in the absence of any divine revelation. The king was a servant of God, just as the rest of us were as well. And Saul seemed to have difficulty with this idea. Saul was replaced by King David, who did a much better job of exemplifying this. Yes, he made mistakes, but importantly, he admitted them, and he confessed and was sorry before God for having done so. He put himself below God in the hierarchy. We can see from his songs and from the Psalms that he had a great longing to be a servant of God, and that has set an example that was essential for our nation. However, like I said, there were still a lot of problems. There was still a lot of war. There were still a lot of people that were drifting away from God. There were still many people who were thinking that maybe they could become king and not be a better servant of God, but take more power and glory for themselves. So unfortunately, this was not a settled period as it should have been. Under Solomon, on the other hand, at the beginning, it definitely seemed like we were going to make it. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, ask, what shall I grant you? Solomon said, you dealt most graciously with your servant, my father David. And now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father. But I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. Your servant finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen. It is hard to know how to lead. And Solomon seems to be admitting this. Grant then your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours? Clearly, Solomon has read all of the previous part of our history, going back to Genesis itself. How are we able to judge between good and evil? We know that we are obligated to do so. We know that we are held accountable when we do so. We know that God has given us instruction to help us do so, but we also know that we still are not always confident in our decisions. And thus, given a gift of additional wisdom would be essential, especially for a king, which will have to answer many questions that the average person would not. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. And God said to him, because you asked for this, I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor will anyone like you arise again. And I also grant you what you did not ask for, meaning the various wealth and peace that might have come, if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David. Now you can see from that last little conditional that this is still trying to remind us that God is not giving a blank check to Solomon, but that God is trying to make sure that he will still be keeping the commandments. That is, after all, the ultimate purpose, that by following the commandments, we will shape our life according to God's covenant in order that our souls will grow towards good and away from what is wrong, going all the way back to that initial point that was made in Genesis, and that we as individuals and as a nation will be able to thus serve as an example, as an instructor, as a guide, as a encouragement to all others, individuals or nations that wish to do likewise. Unfortunately, Solomon was not a perfect king, especially in the later years of his life. He brought a lot of problems into his life. He brought a lot of people, in particular, the wives that he married from foreign countries that brought idolatry back into the land, and it became a very common practice. Yes, he built the temple, and yes, he helped defend the land and brought a lot of peace, but he did so through forced labor and what was considered an excessive amount of forced labor. And when he died, there was an opportunity for a little bit of a reset to help rebalance the kingdom for the benefit of all. However, his son Rehoboam did not do a good job. The people went to him and asked, "Your father," meaning Solomon, "made our yoke heavy. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you." Basically meaning, look, things have been very tough. We've been working ourselves to death for your father. How about if we have a break now, with you being the new king, and things will be, we will be indebted to you and loyal to you forever. Rehoboam answered to them, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me," meaning give me time to consider. King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders. They answered him, "Do it. If you will be a servant to these people today and serve them, and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servants always." They say, look, this is good. You have an opportunity here to have the ultimate goodwill of the people that will become an enduring feature. Yes, give them more time. Do not demand so much from them. Do not force them to do labor as your father did, and you will be able to have a beautiful permanent kingdom. But he ignored the advice that the elders gave him. There's that stiff neck again, and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and who were serving him. They answered, "Say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins," which is a terrible euphemism and statement. "My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, but I will flog you with scorpions." Again, we see this stiff-neckedness. We see somebody who is afraid to look weak, somebody who thinks that because he is king, he can do what he wishes, and that he is in a position to dominate and exploit others. That is not the point of having a king, as we discussed way back in the book of Samuel, and the king is meant to see himself as a servant of God, and as such, a servant of the people who also are servants of God. Unfortunately, Rehoboam listened to the wrong advice, he chose the wrong path, and the kingdom is split. We have a northern kingdom that breaks away, which the majority of the tribes, and then we have the southern kingdom focused around Jerusalem that remain under the Davidic line. And the northern kingdom eventually gets wiped out. Right? Many prophets warned the northern kingdom to cleave to God, but they worshipped idols and broke all rules. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire completed their destruction of the northern kingdom and carried off the vast majority of the people to be scattered. And they are now lost. When we talk about the lost tribes, this is what we are talking about. You can read more about this in the Book of Kings. This northern kingdom's destruction was a huge blow to our people. And it was a huge reminder that, yes, we had a job to do, but that didn't mean God was going to give us forever to do it. God expected us to keep to the commandments, to raise ourselves up, and to avoid idolatry, and to avoid all of the horrible acts of exploitation, murder, theft, robbery, taking advantage of the poor, everything else that the prophets decry throughout their prophecies against the north, that if we do all of those things, then we will not be protected. And in a sense, there will be little purpose to us remaining as a coherent group. After all, it is meant that as a group, we will be able to lift the banner of the right way to live. And the North, after hundreds of years, was clearly showing they were not getting the message. Now you might be thinking, great, so the Southern Kingdom, that's where the future lies. And it does, but not before it also goes through a catastrophe. In 586, the Babylonian Empire dominates, after having dominated the Assyrian Empire, then comes and destroys the southern kingdom as well. Now, we had already been a vassal state to Babylon, but we thought we could break away with the help of Egypt. Egypt betrayed us, and we ended up going into a pointless rebellion that led to the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the exile of our people into Babylon. Now, this should have been the end, but there was still a remnant, there was still a core of people who had remained loyal to God that went through this period and reforged themselves into a stronger version of our faith and commitment to each other there in exile of Babylon. And that allowed us to return and to begin to rebuild. We could have fallen apart, but we did not. The Torah, the Psalms, the Mitzvot, they bound us together even in that foreign land and really created what we would now recognize as the infant form of the synagogue, a community center where people could be united through Judaism and be united by reinforcing the idea that we had a mission of a way to live. Now, the Babylonians were eventually conquered by the Persians, and when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, they had a more tolerant view towards the different minorities, and they allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel and even begin to rebuild the temple approximately 70 years after that destruction. We were not independent. We were still a vassal state of the Persian Empire. We were still just one of many of the different countries that they ruled, but we were able to self-govern by and large. And indeed, we see during this time that the people were better than they had been before. Idolatry had been removed. People were less prone to many of the different moral failings. We had grown from this process. Come on. Now, the Persian Empire would eventually be defeated by Alexander the Great in 332. And Alexander the Great continued that idea of toleration, meaning that as long as we paid our taxes and didn't cause any trouble, we could self-govern ourselves. Now, when he died in 323, the empire that he had created was split up among his different generals, and we became part of the Ptolemaic Empire, which was ruled out of Egypt. Now, over the next 100 years, there would be many wars between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, which was centered more in Asia. And eventually in 201, we would become part of the Seleucid Empire permanently. And during that period, there was a lot of influence of Hellenism, that is to say of Greek culture, both from the Ptolemies and the Seleucids when they were governing us. However, we still had the right to rule ourselves, to govern ourselves, and to follow our faith as we wished. And that, as we've been hopefully noticing, was the main point. Being in Israel wasn't just about having a particular piece of land. It was about having a place where we could live out a Jewish life according to the instructions God had given us so that we could rise in the right direction. In 168, well, we have to revolt because the Seleucid Empire has now established rules against us, which were forcing us to give up, to abandon our Jewish life, our Torah. And although there were Jews who were on the Seleucid side, which rendered this much a civil war, ultimately the Maccabees, later known as the Hashmonean dynasty, were able to lead our side to independence and to allow ourselves to live a Jewish life. This was the first time we had been independent since all the way back in 586. So for 400-ish years, we had been this tributary of the Persians, and then Alexander, and then the Ptolemies, and then the Seleucids, and now we are free. A small little state. This was not nearly the giant kingdom of Solomon, but we were free completely. But unfortunately, the Hashmoneans continue the pattern of being bad rulers that we have been plagued with since the beginning. And although personal devotion and commitment to Judaism is growing during this time, our political and official religious institutions, namely the temple, are becoming more and more corrupt and more problematic. And that means that as they begin to fall, they reach out for help and they reach out to Rome. Rome was the rising power of the Mediterranean, and the two sons, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, thought that Rome would support one or the other, which they did, but in doing so, they made us part of the Roman Empire. So in 663 BCE, less than 100 years after we had become independent, we are now dependent once more on a new empire, this time the Romans. And by 37 BCE, the Hashmoneans were out. Herod was in as a puppet king from Rome, and that meant that we were now completely subjugated once more. We had many different revolts against Rome. We did not like this idea of being under their thumb. And eventually, the Great War against Rome between 66 and 70 CE led to the destruction of the Second Temple. And this began a period of decline within the state of Israel. It wasn't all at once, but over the next couple of centuries, there would be multiple revolts, 115 CE, and then most famously 132 CE, led by Bar Kokhba, that would eventually drive the Jews of the land of Israel over the next century and a half into dispersal. We were still able for a little while to thrive under rabbinic leadership, to help codify, clarify, and strengthen our teachings, and to disseminate, to spread that information to the Jewish communities that were spread now far and wide across the Roman Empire and what had been the Babylonian Persian empires. And this was an important strengthening of not only those foreign communities, but also of the power of the individual to, under any circumstances, be able to still find a personal connection to God. That without the temple and the altar that had been with us now for 1,000 years, we were nevertheless able to be right with God, to be strong in our faith, and to be clear in our practices. And this would become essential for the next few thousand years. At this time, we completed the text that we've talked about way back at the beginning of this series, the early Midrashim, which capture the interpretation, the Mishnah, which has the clearest teachings of the law, and this became an essential component of our suitcase when traveling around the world for the next 2,000 years. Now, this part of the Roman Empire would eventually become what is known as the Byzantine Empire, meaning the split of Rome into the Eastern Empire and Western Empire. We would be under the Eastern imperial rule. Now, things were roughly stable, but things began to deteriorate as there were more and more harsh decrees. And despite a few moments when it looked like the Roman Empire might be more favorable to us, maybe even let us rebuild the temple, unfortunately, new rulers would come into position that would crack down on our community again, and it became more and more intolerable. Also during this time, there was more debate, more clarification, more wisdom and study being shared, and this would eventually be written into what we call the Jerusalem Talmud. Meanwhile, and continuing in the community of Old Babylon, which is why we call it Bavel in Hebrew, but really it was part of the Persian Empire at this time, the Jews who were still there were doing quite well. Many Jews were moving now from the West, from the land of Israel, to escape Roman oppression into that, and there were communities and academies that were doing quite well. There wasn't the same type of oppression, although we weren't necessarily at the top of the social hierarchy in Persia, and this allowed us to have a moment's respite for a flourishing of Jewish philosophy, of Jewish law, of Jewish poetry, and Jewish creativity of all types. And this would eventually culminate in the creation of the Babylonian Talmud, which would become the last universally accepted book in Jewish literature, in a sense, finishing off the second level of the canon. This was also the time of what we call the Gaonim, who were the great leaders in this community that would communicate far and wide to share their wisdom, to answer questions, and to clarify any points of Jewish law. Ultimately, however, those lines of communication would be more difficult to maintain, and the thrust of Jewish vitality would be moving westward to Europe. There in Europe, we already had communities that had grown up during the Roman times, but during the Dark Ages, they began to take deeper root and to expand. Some of this was good, some of this was bad. On the one hand, we were not bound into that feudal system that is so famous of the lord, the knight, and the peasant, or serfs in the European society. But we also didn't have a knight or lord directly protecting us that we knew we would have the right to demand their services. So this meant that we were in awkward positions. Many places also did not allow us to own land. And since we did have better international merchant channels, since we had Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, it meant that Jews became quite successful, that is to say, some families in the mercantile trades. And even those that were not doing the trading themselves would often have an avenue for selling their goods and services in a more wide area. Also, despite what you might have imagined, there was not as much overt religious hostility during this period. And in fact, even under the Charlemagne rule, Jews were encouraged to come and settle in different parts of his empire. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, there was the beginning of a new faith known as Islam. In 610, Muhammad established what we now recognize as Islam. And as it began to try and capture the peninsula, the Saudi peninsula, as well as spread, Jewish groups were often bullied and attacked, trying to lean on us to convert, to join them in their new faith. Now, eventually, Islam does spread throughout Arabia, as well as the Middle East and across North Africa. In 637, it captures Jerusalem. And at the time, they allow Jews to return to the city, but create something that is known as the Pact of Omar, which states that Jews cannot build new synagogues, they cannot pray loudly, and they cannot stop Jews from converting, meaning leaving Judaism and becoming Muslim. Also, we had a second-class citizen in the civil society. We couldn't hold legal posts, and we had to wear a yellow star to be identified. And yes, this was the earliest instance of this forced identification symbol. Now, throughout the next few centuries, we had some good periods and some bad periods with the different Muslim communities. There were times when we were more at peace, when we were given more rights, and where we had more freedoms and privileges than we did under the rulership in Christian Europe. And there were times when that went the other way. Now, on the whole, there were many good communities that were able to thrive, especially in the Spanish communities in the Iberian Peninsula, that were able to become incredibly fertile places for reason, for science, for arts, for poetry, for the flourishing of Jewish literature in a way that had not been seen in such large part for 1,000 years. This is why it's often called the Golden Age. However, the Golden Age was not uninterrupted. It was constantly punctuated by new rulers taking over, often having different ideas about the role of Jews and the expulsion of Jews or the temporary conversion of Jews was a fairly common practice. And so we learned to live with it while maintaining our Judaism through all of this. Now, as I said at the very beginning, you can see that despite these changes, despite these upheavals, the revolts, the destruction of the temple, the expulsions, everything that's going on, we seem to now have the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual toolkit to enable us to, as a people, to overcome all of these different circumstances. Especially now that we are spread more globally, we are not subject at any one time to a global crisis for the Jewish population, but instead, this community may be going down, but another might be rising. And this gives us a way to begin to have a chance for a more holistic growing of the Jewish people towards strength and understanding. There's a flourishing of Jewish writings throughout this period that is really quite unparalleled. However, all good things begin to come to an end in 1095 when the Pope declares the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were obviously terrible for the Muslims in the East, but they were especially bad for Jews in both the West and the East, as they strike out in order to conquer the Mediterranean and to be on this religious mission of murder. They decide to also begin to crack down and destroy many of the Jewish communities that are in Europe itself. So tens of thousands of Jews were killed at this time. And when the Crusaders did finally reach the land of Israel and the other areas around it, many others were killed as well. This also began a period of more forced conversions or of driving us into refugee movements as we tried to flee this. This also became the beginning of a more militant piety, a seeking of holiness through arms, and antagonism between Christianity and Judaism that would only begin to rise over the next few centuries. And this would ultimately lead to a increasingly rapid pattern of expulsions, more xenophobia and hatred of outsiders that would eventually take away some of the rights that we had, until in many places we were left living only in walled communities by strict order. That would be gated and locked at night, literally like a prison. These ghettos became a familiar feature of European cities for the next few centuries. And they had a very corrosive effect on the Jewish community as well. You can imagine a people that were cosmopolitan, that were worldly, outward-looking, that were known for their widespread communication and study, to suddenly be cut off and trapped, and to have so many of their avenues for life curtailed to only the narrow confines of these neighborhoods. This was a huge blow to the European community. This is why many of the Jews of Western Europe, where this began to move east, where there was still a more welcoming attitude towards Jews. Also at the same time, we see a decline in Islam measured by its openness, its welcomeness to new ideas, not only of Judaism, but even of science and art. It becomes more conservative in outlook, as it is repelling not only the invasion of the Crusades, but also repelling the Mongolian invasion. And as such, it sort of settles down into this perpetual gloom that puts more pressure on the Jewish communities inside their territories. And at the same time as it is having this intellectual crisis, it also has an economic crisis and a knowledge crisis, because the Europeans no longer are coming through the Mediterranean, but are now bypassing the Middle East entirely, going around Africa for their trade to the east, or eventually, of course, going on the westward journeys that will lead to the discovery of the New World. And the Jewish communities that lived inside this area, known as the Mizrahi, unfortunately were also hurt, sometimes directly by the Muslims, sometimes merely by sharing the diminished capacity and the diminished commerce and vitality of these nations. In 1492, a proto-Holocaust begins in Spain. The Spanish decide, having retaken the peninsula, having returned it to its Catholic form, that everybody must leave or convert. As Jews, most people say, well, we've seen this story before. All we have to do is go, sure, we'll do what you say, and continue to be Jewish in our private life. And in another year or two, maybe a little bit longer, we'll be able to come out of hiding and go back to being openly Jewish again. Unfortunately, this was not the case. The Inquisition was set up, and many Jews that were pretending to be Christian to wait out this process of forced conversion were caught and murdered throughout this time period. Many Jews also did think that maybe the writing was on the wall, and they fled. And they went mostly to North Africa, the Middle East, to Turkey and Greece. There were some that went and resettled in the land of Israel, which was not an independent Jewish country at the time, but we still had the chance to move there. Some also went up to Holland, and others went over to the New World, first in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and then also eventually up into what would become the United States as well. These communities collectively are called Sephardim, are called Sephardic communities, because they originated in Spain. But for many centuries, many of them have not lived in Spain. Many of them don't even speak Spanish, although they might speak what is known as Ladino, which is a Hebrew-Spanish blend that was created during the time of Spain. Following this, in the next couple centuries, we begin to see Europe, where a large number of Jews live, go through a change of attitudes. This is called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment changed things in Europe a number of different ways. They said the country should be organized around identity rather than just the king. That means you should have French people, you should have German people, you should have English people, rather than just being which king has the piece of paper that says he can claim that territory. No longer would you expect one king to rule over parts of France, parts of England, as you did during the Henrys, for example. From now on, it would be identity politics, if you will. At the same time, there was a growing notion that human beings as individuals would have inherent dignity. Imagine the thought, going back all the way to Bereshit, that humanity as individuals were created in the image of God. Finally, the Enlightenment is telling the Europeans that maybe that is true and maybe something that should be acted on. And thus the individual has rights to be protected. The idea began to grow that critical, rational thinking could solve all problems, and that proof, meaning actual evidence, would be considered more important than authority. Now, most of these ideas are good, and we agree with them as Jews. The identity kings thing is going to come back to bite us, as are some of the twisted ways that the other principles are going to be put into practice. Because what happens with this national identity is the rise of what we now call nationalism. Nationalism essentially says that you may have once been the property of the king, but now you're nobody. Now you are just a foreigner living in our country. You have no one to look after you, and you have no one that is going to support you. Now, remember, as Jews had been shoved into ghettos and isolated from the general population, it meant that we were, in many places, quite distinct from the general population. And this highlighted the problem in the eyes of many of the native Europeans. And we'll talk some other time about how not native all of them were, but not tonight. So this meant that Jews were put in a quandary. How do we respond to this situation? Well, some of the Europeans wanted to accept us, but they said so that they would only do so if we gave up our group identity. And these are the ones that the early Reform thinkers agreed with and created that early Reform movement. As I said before, when I talked about the movements in general, this does not mean the current Reform movement would agree with this, but back in the early 1800s, this was the idea. Many other Jews said, we cannot assimilate, we cannot change. In fact, we need to change to be more restrictive, to be more rigid, to protect ourselves from these dangerous Enlightenment ideas. And this became what we would now recognize as orthodoxy. And still others said, well, you know what? They will never let us fit in, regardless of what they say. And just trying to hide in our own insular communities is eventually going to backfire on us. We need to have a place of our own. If the French get a place of their own, if the British get a place of their own, if the Germans get a place of their own, we should have a place of our own too. And then we can be just like them by being ourselves in our own land. That meant having our own land. And this is what laid the groundwork for what we would now recognize as Zionism. The idea that there should be a country that is a place for Jews, and that it should be set in the land that had been ours for so long, the land of Israel. And this led to the establishment of the state of Israel, which we will cover in much more detail in later classes. So this means we now come to the modern world. And in the modern world, we have seen the repercussions of all of this. We have seen the worst of nationalism, culminating in Germany and many other places as well. We have seen the peak of Zionism, bringing the miracle of the foundation of Israel. We have seen large-scale assimilation, Jews just disappearing into the great masses of the secular world around us and losing their Jewish identity altogether. We have seen enormous growth in Jewish learning in all communities. The fact that there are more people studying Torah and traditional texts now than ever before in our history, and they are more accessible to more people. We have seen even more isolation in different varieties of orthodoxy that try to close themselves off not only from the modern world, but even from other Jewish communities. We have seen the conservative movement, that's me, try to recapture the organic blend of tradition and modernity to varying degrees of success at different times. And most importantly, we should recognize we have not seen the end of the story. Beginning with creation, with that first human given all of the world a possibility of being able to guide their destiny in an almost godlike fashion, recognizing that we have had many failings and the individual needs support and help. God gave us Torah, God gave us a nation, and God gave us a mission to be able to grow and equip ourselves for all that history would have to offer. We have had some moments where we have been able to shine out and share so much. We have had moments where we have been pushed into the dark closet of different places. We have had moments where we have succumbed to despair and destruction. But we continue to rise, and we continue to have shown so much light on the world that we can take much credit for the rising life in this world that brings so much goodness to so many people. But we're not done yet. There is still much to do. History is still moving forward, and we still have more of the story to write. All right, 1 minute or 1 hour and 2 minutes. So almost in an hour. I hope no one will hold me accountable for slightly going over my stated goal of finishing this in an hour. We will talk about the history of the establishment of the State of Israel in much more detail, not because it's the most important part of Jewish history, but because it is one of the most misunderstood parts of Jewish history. Everything else that we discussed can be learned to a much greater degree by going and studying any number of books on all of these topics in down to a microscopic degree. Please enjoy Jewish history. You will find within it so many of the treasures that we take for granted. You will see how they were born, how they grew, and how they can continue to inspire us. But hopefully this broad overview will give you a little bit more understanding of not only where we are, but why we are here and doing what we do. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.